Hello and welcome to our second computer side chat. Today we're going to be talking about the concept of nationalism. Specifically, what is nationalism and how did it spread across Europe and what was the impact of it? So the first question you probably have is, what is nationalism? And we have talked about that a little bit in class, but before we actually come up with a common definition, I want to give you some visual ideas of what it is, some good things and some bad. So the good sides of nationalism might take the shape of this, or if you've been to sporting events before, something like this. That said, nationalism does have its ugly side. For example, we see something like this, a sign from the recent protests within Europe against Muslim refugees from Syria, which is embroiled in a civil war right now, coming over and seeking safety within Europe. To an even worse degree, we can see nationalism take shape like this. We're not going to talk about him or the advent of German nationalism until much later, but it does kind of give you an idea of, at its very extreme, what nationalism can result in. So before we come up with that common definition, let's talk about what did Europe look like at this point in time. So after the French Revolution and after the Congress of Vienna, we see this big debate break out of what should governments in Europe look like. And there are three main political movements. This should sound relatively familiar because we learned about political factions during the French Revolution. So the first movement was that of conservatism, and these were wealthy property owners, nobility, and they wanted to protect the monarchies of Europe, keep the kings in power. Obviously, this is inspired by the royalists of the French Revolution. Next would be the liberal movement, which is mostly middle class. These are merchants, these are business leaders, and they wanted to give more power to elected parliaments or elected legislative bodies. But they only wanted the educated and the landowning to be able to vote. Finally were the radicals, and they favored drastic change to extend democracy to all, not just the educated and the landowning, but to everyone. And they believed that governments should practice the ideals of the French Revolution, which were liberty, equality, and brotherhood. And obviously this sounds very, very familiar to the Jacobins of the French Revolution. As this debate is being had, we see a new movement start to pop up around Europe. And that movement is called nationalism. So nationalism is the belief that people's greatest loyalty should not be to a king or an empire, but to a nation of people who share a common culture and history. This is something that's now becoming widespread, but it's not necessarily new. We saw it with the American colonists who, rather than bow down to what King George wanted, they stood up for what they believed government should be, and also what the ideals and principles of an American government should be. We saw this with the French Third Estate, who didn't back down from Louis XVI, but instead rose up trying to create a government that was more inclusive and more by the people. And we saw this with the Latin American Creoles, who wanted to kick the Peninsulares out so they could form a government that was more in line with what they wanted. And so we see with all of these, people are caring less about following what the king wants and more about their national identity, which is a concept we've mentioned a little bit in class. They care more about the people of America who have a common culture and history, or the French people who all have a common culture and history, or the Latin American people who all have a common culture and history. It's putting the people or the nation ahead of the interest of the king. So this movement largely favored the ideas of liberals and radicals, and we see a pushback across Europe. We see this movement really pushing against the idea of a monarchy, of a king making all the decisions and ruling absolutely. So what did nationalists want in particular? So they wanted to create nation states. Let's really quickly break that down into its two separate terms before we come back and come up with a definition for the combined phrase. So, first off, a nation is a large group of people that share common characteristics. So, for example, when people refer to Ohio State fans, you might have heard the term before Buckeye Nation. And this refers to the large group of people that share the common characteristic of cheering for the Ohio State Buckeyes. That said, a nation doesn't necessarily have defined borders and a government overseeing it. So, for example, Buckeye Nation, while most Buckeye fans come from Ohio, we don't necessarily have an outlined territory for all Buckeye fans, and there's not a government of the Buckeye fans who oversees all of us and makes decisions for us. And then, secondly, there is a state, which this is an organized community living under a single government. So, unlike a nation, this is a specific territory with outlined borders, and there is a government that oversees everything and makes decisions. So, we put those two terms together and we get a nation state. And a nation state is a group of people who share similar characteristics or history that are joined and represented by a single government. So, the United States is a nation state. We are a group of people who share similar characteristics or history, similar characteristics in terms of what we feel makes up an American, and we are joined and represented by a single government, although that government does have several levels from national to state to local. And so this is what nationalists wanted in Europe in the early 19th century. And specifically, they believed that nation states should be created and also that government should serve the best interests of the nation and its people rather than the interests of a single ruler. So again, the same thing we started to see with the French Third Estate, with the Creoles, with the American colonists. We want to create a government that isn't looking out for just the king. We want a government that's looking out for what is best for the people. At this point, the only nation states within Europe are France, England, and Spain. Before I go on, this slide is not something you need to memorize or write down. I just like to go over this because I think when you say, well, there are only 3 nation states within Europe, the question immediately comes up, well, what is everyone else then? And so most other European countries and most countries across the world for the most part fit into one of 3 categories. So they might have been a kingdom, and an example of this would have been Italy at the time. And that is a territory that is ruled by a king. The territory's name itself is essentially meaningless, as all loyalty is professed to the king rather than a single nation or cultural identity. So this was really prevalent during the Middle Ages. So if you were a peasant in France during medieval times, you wouldn't necessarily say, I'm a peasant from France, I'm a Frenchman. You would probably say, I'm a peasant, I work a farm under King so-and-so. You would identify more with your king than where you lived. The second thing, or second category that countries in Europe would fall under would be an empire, which would be either Austria or Prussia, or part of one. And so an example of that would be Spain's colonial holdings in Latin America. And so an empire is a group of states ruled by a single government, monarch, or nation state. For example, Latin American countries like, say, Mexico. Mexico wasn't independent, but it also wasn't directly part of Spain. Instead, it was part of Spain's empire. It was ruled by the Spanish, specifically through the Peninsulares, but it is not itself an independent nation state. You might be asking at this point, well, if that's the case, then how is Spain both a nation state and an empire? To be honest, you can be both. So Spain itself is a nation state that had an empire. It had colonial holdings, and we'll get more into that when we get to what's called imperialism. Lastly, and this is at this point really, really rare, but something else would have been a city-state. And a city-state is an independent city with its own independent governing body. This might be Florence or Venice from the Renaissance, or Athens in ancient Greece. So what makes up this national identity or the bond within a nation state? Technically, we say six things go into forming a national identity. First is culture, a shared way of life revolving around things like what do we eat, how do we dress, how do we behave. Culture tends to be the first thing we talk about. Second is history, common past. Where do we come from? Does our nation have a past that we can all reflect on and see has had an impact on our country? Language is another big one. So, for example, the nation state of France spoke predominantly French. Territory, we all live in the territory of the United States. We all have that in common. Nationality, ethnicity, or race. We have a common nationality or ethnicity or race. And lastly, while this one is becoming less prevalent today, it's still important, religion. So at this point, Europe would have been predominantly Christian. If you were in France, it would be predominantly Catholic. If you were in England, predominantly Anglican, and so forth. So let's review. Political ideas based around the idea of nationalism challenged the ideas of conservatism across Europe. Liberals and radicals who wanted governments that were more representative and represented the best interests of the people pushed back against conservatives and the idea of absolute monarchies. Nationalism is the belief that people's greatest loyalty should not be to a king or an empire, but to a nation of people who share a common culture and history. Nationalists tended to favor the creation of nation states, which were groups of people who share similar characteristics or history that are joined and represented by a single government. And finally, nation states and national identity within it tend to revolve around the shared bonds of culture, history, language, territory, nationality, and religion. So that is all for me. Next, you guys will be rolling into investigating what was the result of nationalism across Europe, how did that impact the continent, and what changed, what didn't change. And then we'll be getting right into our major project for this unit. Thanks for listening, and have a good day.